Hello everybody. If ever you were looking for the automotive equivalent of the disappointing child prodigy, it has to be McLaren. After all, here is a company that just over a decade ago was given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A brand spanking new supercar firm whose only connection to road-going cars of the past was what many deemed to be the greatest ever made, the F1. A company that had decades of proud and successful Formula One racing heritage, a workforce comprised of talented and vibrant engineers with incredible and innovative ideas, and a brand spanking new facility in which to make them come to life. And a company that also did not have 50 or 60 years of heritage weighing them down. McLaren really had it all. And yet, if today you were to say to anybody, would you want to spend your hard-earned money on one? Many of them would go, yeah, no, actually, I don't think I would really. They'd rather spend their money on the Ferrari equivalent, even when it costs twice as much. Today I am sat in a McLaren 720S, a car that gives hypercar performance for Porsche 911 prices. And yet still, people don't want them. Why not? Well, maybe because I'm sat in the bastard thing with the key trying to get it to start, and it tells me this key is not in the vehicle. I mean, people wonder why nobody wants to buy a McLaren, honestly. Well, core blimey, what a palaver that was. For my American friends, that means, my, what an unnecessary struggle. I believe the issue was I just wasn't pressing the brake hard enough. And before you all hit the comments to call me a simpleton, I have been living with this car for a month now. I have started it successfully every other time, but this time apparently I wasn't pushing hard enough. Did a quick bit of research and somebody said, yeah, that happens. Just jab the brake pedal and it might fire into life. And so it did. Anyway, back to the glorious topic of McLaren and why it is that they struggled and continue to do so. Now, back in the day, McLaren really were a very, very exciting company to be around. And just in case anybody thinks that what I have to say is the result simply of bitterness or the fact that I can't afford one and that I don't really know what I'm talking about because I've never owned one, well, for about 10 years now, I have been involved with people that have had McLarens. I have, over the years, gotten to know people that work for McLaren, subsequently that used to work for McLaren, also McLaren dealerships, McLaren specialists, independents, so on and so forth, and of course I am now involved in the motor industry in general. And my opinion is forged from a mixture of my own experiences, those of the people that I know, and also my gut feeling, which I think is an often underestimated tool, because you can look at data, but anybody that knows statistics will tell you they aren't quite as definitive as companies might like you to believe. And very often, the best judge you will ever have is your own sense of what feels right or not. However, if you would like an alternative take on the well-being of the likes of McLaren, Ferrari, Aston Martin and others, I can highly recommend the blog Karenable, which is the online continuation of the secret supercar owners' blogs from the back of Evo magazine. He clearly is a man involved in the business world because he understands things like quarterly shareholder breakdowns of forecasts and that sort of thing, and he turns them into articles that are easy to understand, but I think very entertaining. And it is from him I know things like the fact that McLaren one year lost £700 million. In fact, averaged out, they were losing something like 400,000 quid on every car sold. That's pretty painful, isn't it? And of course, you might imagine, that's not a very sustainable business plan. And in many ways, McLaren in that year particularly were certainly the victims of circumstance. There weren't many car companies that had a great 2020 to 2022. But there were also a lot of factors that McLaren could and did directly influence and still managed to cock up. So, to fully understand what exactly happened, we need to wind the clock back a little bit. And let's start, shall we, in 2010, when what was then called the MP4 12C finally broke cover and made its public debut at the Goodwood Motor Circuit. And this was an incredibly exciting moment for anybody that called themselves petrolhead, because up until that point, if you wanted a supercar, you bought a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. That was just about it. And over the years, other companies had certainly dabbled with the format, like Honda or Maserati, some more successful than others. But if you wanted your meat and potatoes, bread and butter supercar, if there were such a thing, you'd buy a Lambo or Ferrari. Simple as that. The fact that we then had a third choice was exciting in of itself, and for it to be McLaren, with all of their prestige and pedigree, well, that was super exciting. And they arrived with some amazing technology, the likes of which even today you still don't get from all of their rivals. Yeah, sure, Lamborghini will give you a carbon cell in, say, the Aventador or its replacement, the Revuelto, but they never did in the Gallardo. They sort of half did in the Huracan, and yes, Maserati have now adopted it, but somehow still made their car weigh 200 kilos more than a McLaren. And Ferrari, well, unless you're going to spend over £1 million, no carbon fibre chassis for you. They keep coming up with different and interesting excuses as to why, but let's be honest here, the McLaren chassis, that's just better, isn't it? They also had some cool interlinked damper technology, active aerodynamics, and that best of all features a supercar could ever have, cool doors. Oh yes, do not underestimate the allure of billionaire doors. But with the 12C, there were a few comments that were made from both the press and also the public. And the main one at the time was that people felt the 12C, well, that it was a plain old looking thing. And in this regard, I think history has maybe started to right a wrong there, because now I look at the 12C and I think it's an amazing piece of design. It's got those classic supercar proportions, is a beautiful blend of both angular and curvaceous. It stands out, it is sleek, it is unadorned with unnecessary addenda. Don't want to have to do that line again. And it just looks darn good, particularly if in one of the signature colours like Volcano Orange, or for me, the best colour of any 12C, Volcano Red. But people said it wasn't really particularly alluring, and bear in mind at the time its rival from Maranello was the 458. Fairly stiff competition if ever you were to have it. And yes, I know that I'm not the biggest fan of the 458, but I seem to be in a minority there. And another area where I think McLaren missed out on something very important, the noise. No McLaren that I've ever heard, with the exception of, say, the F1 and the Solus, and neither of those count for the purpose of today, sounds that great. They all sound more or less exactly the same. At startup, there's a nice industrious noise, the sound of a very busy engine. But beyond that, it never really ever gets all that much more interesting. No matter what kind of exhaust you put on one of these cars, they always sound just about the same. And every time I have somebody come to me and say, James, no, I've sorted it. I've got an amazing exhaust on my McLaren. You'll love it. It sounds brilliant. No, it doesn't. It just sounds louder. Never any more interesting. I complain that the 458 isn't the best sounding car, but put an exhaust on that and it sounds like nothing else. It's incredible. And then when it comes to the likes of the Gallardo, the Huracan, or the Aventador, they are a symphony on four wheels. And so that is one area that I think McLaren really did misunderstand the way a supercar works. They didn't realise just how important theatrics were to the whole experience. I know a lot of people out there that maybe don't really like supercars all that much will look at them and go, well, I don't understand it. My Nissan GT-R is just as fast as that Ferrari. What's the point? And McLaren themselves made this very mistake, because they presumably took a Ferrari and probably a 911 turbo, and they measured these cars and went, right, okay, so this one does this, this, and this, so our car will do this, and this, plus 5%, plus 10%. Ergo, it will be better. And that's how race cars work. But it's not how road cars work, and it's certainly not how supercars work. But still, it didn't matter because McLaren were a new company and they were enjoying a honeymoon period. So even things like the early 12Cs being somewhat wonky affairs didn't get in the way too much. McLaren, I think, in many cases did try to run before they could walk, and this is going to be a recurring theme in this video. Case in point, the early 12Cs, they had an infotainment system that McLaren branded Iris. And the problem with Iris was that, well, in the first press cars, I wouldn't say that she was broken, because she was simply absent. They had a devil of a time getting the system to work. It went through several different iterations, and at the end of the day, they just ran out of time. So the very first press drives were done with cars that did not have functional infotainment. And that's embarrassing. Really, really embarrassing. And again, I think McLaren misunderstood a very, very basic principle, not simply of the car world, but just of the world, and that is the importance of a first impression. Eventually, they did get Iris to work in a very, very basic way. They later upgraded it to Iris 2, and that worked a little bit better, but only a little bit. It was never a particularly brilliant system. The early 12Cs were also blighted by other minor inconveniences, like the fact that they tried to have some very fancy way of getting in the doors. You just swiped under it, and it was supposed to open. But a lot of the time, it didn't, including in the rain. These are things that can very, very quickly put you off a brand. And early on, the cars did start to suffer from a few issues, including the likes of coolant hose failures, because McLaren used the cheapest clamps known to man, and over time they failed and let go. Provided the driver stopped the car soon enough, not really a particularly massive issue, but one that should never have happened. Gearboxes also suffered failures, but at the time, Ferrari, even Mercedes were also having issues with DCTs, and so I don't think you can say that is responsible for McLaren's woes. And the next car they came out with, the P1, well, if the 12C had made a name for itself, well, the P1 set the world on fire. This was part of the hypercar trinity of 2013, and you know what? If I were to win the Euro Millions tonight, I'd buy every single one of those. But I think the one I'd be most curious to drive has to be the P1. That's a 900 horsepower hybrid turbo nutter wagon, an absolutely ludicrous car, and it's a real looker. The 12C, though technically styled by Frank Stephenson, he would tell you he only got to the project fairly late, and so didn't have all that much influence over it. But the P1 he could get his claws into very early on, and it shows. That is a stunning piece of design. Over 10 years later, and it still looks box fresh. It's just magical, and that's to say nothing of the performance. And yeah, I know, in the real world, this is basically just as quick, but I don't care. Supercars don't really live in the real world. I think in particular we got to give special credit to one Mr. C. Harris for his video on one, because if ever there were a video make me want a car, it's got to be that one. Things then continued to get better, because the next car McLaren built, that was the 650S, and it took essentially what was good about the 12C and made what wasn't so good a little bit better. They took the front end from the P1, basically grafted it onto a 12C body, made a few other changes, so stylistically it's a bit of an odd duck. But in terms of the drive, it righted a great many wrongs, and today I often tell people that everything you've read about the 12C, the way it rides, the way it drives, all that, it's true of the 650S. The 12C's got a lot of imperfections. The 650 though, a big leap on. They also made many changes, some small, some large, to the ways that the cars were built, and overall it does seem like they actually made a lot of improvements. Everybody I speak to that works both for McLaren and McLaren related businesses tells me that the 650S is a generally pretty darn good car. And then to complete the 1-2 punch of 650S and P1 with a knockout blow, they gave us the 675 LT, their answer to the likes of the Ferrari 430 Scuderia and the 458 Speziale. And that today is generally regarded by all and sundry as just about the best car the firm ever built that won't set you back £1 million or more. However, while this was all going on, there were still things going wrong behind the scenes because these cars were continuing to have issues. Yes, they had improved certain things, but they also hadn't fixed others. And the way these were dealt with, unfortunately, I think, sowed the seeds of what later became a very, very large problem tree. Because you see, what happened is in the early days, McLaren was a very small company, and as a startup, it didn't really have all that many dealers, and those dealers themselves weren't particularly big businesses. So when the cars arrived and they had issues, often there was a little bit of a queue to get the car on the ramp. Then when it got on the ramp and they found out what the problem was, they had to order the parts in, and things took quite some time. Owners understandably got a little bit irate and things weren't all that great. I know of quite a few people in those early days who had the cars and were very, very upset at the service they received. In particular, the fact that they were paying for a 675 LT, but what they were driving around in was a Mercedes C-Class. And the general comment was, it was a very, very expensive way to buy a C200 diesel. And so, what the dealers did to fix this problem was they decided to try and give the customers value for money, which took a very odd form. So let me give you an example. I heard a story, and it is a story, but one that I believe, of a dealer that had a car in with a weeping sump on the engine, an issue that simply required the sump to be removed and a new gasket to be applied. However, for reasons that I've never really quite understood, instead of actually fixing the issue, they instead put in for a new engine. And at this point in time, the dealers were allowed to self-authorize. So basically, they could say what was wrong with the car, and they could give themselves permission to order the parts. And so that's what this dealer did, ordered a new engine for the car at a cost of some £72,000. And their logic was, when the customer came to pick up the car, which had been away for 5 or 6 months, they could say, oh yes, we're very sorry sir, this has been an inconvenience, but for your money, you've actually had so much, because we've done £90,000 worth of work to the car. And I think what they were expecting was the customers to say, oh wow, that's amazing, that's really good value, yeah, cool, thank you so much. What instead happened was the customers went, I'm sorry, what? The car was how broken, and the parts cost how much? Oh my god, well I don't want to have this thing when the warranty's gone. And this did start to dent the values somewhat, but even so, even come 2016, 2017, values were fairly good. Although McLaren did continue to make some missteps. For example, when the 650S was announced, it was announced as a model to sit alongside the 12C, not as its replacement, which it was clear to everybody it was. I mean, why would you buy a 12C when you could have the 650S? It got you so much more power, better looks, better steering, better gearbox, and ceramic brakes as standard, all for about £20,000. It would be a no-brainer to have the 650S. I think about a month in, McLaren admitted this and just quietly discontinued the 12C, but things were generally okay. And I think they were okay in part because these were really, really rare cars. I seem to recall McLaren made something like 3,500 each of both 12C and 650S. They're super rare things. Compare that to any mid-engine V8 Ferrari. I mean, they made more 355s than that, to say nothing of 458s. But then McLaren made what I feel was one of their biggest mistakes. They introduced the Sport Series. This is the 570S, 570 GT, the 540C, and the 600 LT, plus other derivatives, the 620R, and also a few regional specific variants. And on the face of it, this was yet again another brilliant move, because they took all of the stuff that you knew and loved about McLaren, nice, potent 3.8 litre Ricardo-built twin-turbo V8, equipped carbon fibre tub, but at a slightly reduced price. It did without the fancy pants hydraulically interconnected suspension and the active aerodynamics, but perhaps because of that, the press then said they were even more fun to drive. And McLaren did some pretty tasty finance deals. I happen to believe that the 540C existed only so that McLaren could promise you a car at a hitherto unthinkable price. You may remember the ad, but I recall seeing a campaign where you could have a McLaren for $999 a month. That is a number that you'd more likely associate with a Porsche or a nice BMW, something like that. For that to get you a McLaren? Oh, wow. Now, they did sort of gloss over the fact that to get that number you had to put in a deposit of like £30,000 or £35,000, and what you'd then get at the end was a 540C. Effectively a detuned version of the 570S with a really not very good at all interior and slightly slower engine, not that anybody probably ever noticed. Seen Through Glass had one, if you remember that, and he got rid of it, I think to a great loss, as did everybody that had a 540C. Today, if you're thinking of buying one, my advice is simply the same as it was then. Don't. Get a 570S at least, because the price difference is basically marginal, but the 570S is the much, much better car. And so, why is it exactly that this was such a big mistake? Well, it's for very, very simple reasons. You see, all of these many problems that I've been mentioning thus far, gearbox issues, coolant hose issues, the infotainment being a little bit wonky, all of that stuff, well, they still existed. McLaren had been working on them, but they hadn't really fixed them, and then somehow along the way, they introduced some other issues too. Except now, they were selling these cars to a lot more people, and by going after the crowd that had had the likes of a 911 before, you are now selling to people that might be using these cars on a daily or certainly more regular basis. People that bought 650s, 675s, that sort of stuff, they were buying them as weekend cars, as occasion cars, as a replacement or an alternative to a Ferrari. And so, if the car was away for a month or two having stuff sorted, yes, sure, it was very inconvenient, but ultimately it wasn't a massive issue. If you were buying one instead of a 911 though, that was a really big problem. McLaren at around this time also made another fatal error, which is that they decided to start building cars for stock. Now at this kind of level, including even for the likes of Porsche, it is fairly common for all cars to be built to order, and sure, dealers will often want a few cars to hang around to have in the showroom and all that, but I recall even 20 years ago, Porsche telling me that every single 911 built in their factory had a customer waiting for it at the other end, even if it was the dealer. But McLaren were just building cars, and they were building cars that didn't necessarily have a buyer on the other end. Now, it wasn't very public at the time, and I later discovered this. McLaren would phone said dealer and say, oh, by the way, a truck's being loaded up, there's 10 570s on it, and yeah, they're going to be with you tomorrow morning, and by the way, you have 48 hours to pay for them. Yeah, no, I'm serious, that is how it worked. And the dealer had to pay if they wanted to stay a McLaren dealer, although I am told if they got a Senna in, they had a whole week to pay for one of those. Now, you'd think McLaren would do this because they were trying to raise revenue, and that I think was almost certainly part of it, but another aspect of it was the fact that the company was just trying to make the numbers look better. But they were committing the cardinal sin of luxury brands. You create desire by creating scarcity. You shouldn't ever have a product like that where you can simply walk into a dealership and take your pick. You should walk into the dealership and be told, oh, sir wants one of those. Well, we might be able to get you on the list, but you know, it's going to be a little while for your car. For such a long time, Ferrari were the masters of this. It was the genius of Luca di Montezemolo to say, however many customers there are for a Ferrari in the world, we will build one less. So there's always somebody that wants one. You start piling them up and stacking them high, you're just going to struggle. And the problem is, when you turn up to a dealership and you see, let's just say, a 600 LT, which is supposed to be a limited edition car, and you see there are 6 of them unsold, well, a dealer's going to really struggle to justify the price they're asking, and so they have to start discounting them. And this got more and more aggressive as time went on. And it got to the point where when my friend James bought his 570S, he put just £10,000 down and was paying about £1,000 a month. Now, if you were listening, do you remember when I said that to get a 540C, you had to put in about 35 grand to get it for £1,000 a month? Yeah, things moved very quickly in the McLaren world. And customers that had been buying them for a little while started to notice this. They had no real fixed schedule for how they did things. You look at Porsche, for example, and you could set your watch by their model release. You get your new 911 comes out, there'll be a Carrera, these days a Carrera GTS. Then a little while after, you'll get the Turbo, you get the GT3, then maybe if they're feeling fruity, you'll get the GT2, then there'll be, say, a Carrera T, perhaps a special edition, there may be an RS, and then, of course, there'll be the facelift. It'll be basically the same thing, but just a little bit better here or there, and then you'll have the same release cycle. It's all very predictable. It means that if you buy a car in the first 6 months of release, you know it's going to be the current one for the next 4 or 5 years at least. With McLaren, though, there was no set schedule. They'd release a model and then a few years later release another one, and when the 720S came out, people looked at it and went, wow, that's incredible, that's amazing, they've really moved the game on. But people that had just bought a 650S were sat there going, excuse me, what? And McLaren dealers were some of the worst, because I remember looking at a car with a friend, and bear in mind at this point in time, I think that the 720S had maybe just come out, but he was looking at either a 570 or a 650S, and the dealer told him, don't buy a 650S, it'll break, and it'll be really expensive. The McLaren dealer told him, don't buy one of our cars, they're not very good. And people wonder why they struggle to sell these things. McLaren's build quality issues persisted, and having spoken to a lot of people, it would appear that the Sport Series cars just weren't built to the same standard as the Super Series ones, which I suppose you'd maybe take as a given, but it was a fairly low bar to begin with. I remember one time speaking to Ferrari and saying, you're not worried about McLaren because their cars are so much faster than yours, they're so much better around a track and they drive great, like surely you're worried that people are going to go over to them? And they said, nah, not really. We said, why not? And they said, those McLaren customers, they always come back. Because they knew people went over to McLaren, bought a car, had such a miserable experience, they just went back to Ferrari. And I'm not saying that Ferrari is always better than McLaren, because it's not, but at least they knew where they stood. And making things even worse, as time went by, the McLaren warranty scheme, which initially was very good, also saw its corners cut. So the customers that did have the cars, did have the warranties, and then did have problems, as a lot of them did. Not all, I know that. Many people have had perfectly good experiences with the McLaren, and I'm glad to hear that. But many also haven't. And those customers, well, their treatment started to get increasingly worse. And this, of course, pushed the prices of the cars down even further, meaning that many people who had bought them, particularly those that bought in early and paid relatively high prices, found themselves in scarily large amounts of negative equity. Just in case you don't understand finance, what that means is if you paid, say, 200 grand for a car, you agree a figure at the start of how much it's going to be worth at the end, and the way McLaren got these deals so cheap was by setting a figure for that was artificially high. So they'd say, oh, well, your car's going to be worth 150 grand in 3 years, when actually, as soon as you drove it out of the showroom, it was worth 140. So you had to pay money to sell the car you'd already paid money for. And the funny thing is, you go and walk around the McLaren factory, do the tour as I have, and at the end of it, you'll stand there and go, I don't really understand how any car could ever leave here anything other than absolutely perfect. But then, when you speak to the people that work there, the answer is tragically obvious. They have quality control processes, they do. They have quality control people, and they get the cars in. They see that there are faults and errors, and they get told, just clear it and move it on. The company was so desperate to just push cars out the door, knowing they were faulty, but also knowing that they wouldn't have to deal with them for a year, they were happy to just kick this can down the road. Until many, many years later, kind of came back to bite them in a very, very big way when they realized that not many people really wanted to buy their cars. And unfortunately, there is a sort of consistent theme here of McLaren not really caring about people. You see, if I were to ask you to name the biggest business on planet Earth, you'd probably say the same one that I would: Amazon. Now, Jeff Bezos is a very, very controversial character, and rightly so, but he has a simple business principle that kind of works, or clearly works, which is, no matter how hard it is for the company, you have to do everything you can to make your customer's life better. And if you do that, they will remain your customer. Far, far easier to keep a customer and sell them something than to try and get a new one. There are only so many people you can convince to buy your product if it isn't a good product. But unfortunately, McLaren became so obsessed with the new customers, they sort of forgot how to look after the existing ones. They also forgot how to look after their staff. And everybody I spoke to that worked at McLaren complained about the fact that, well, the parking was basically impossible, that they had to hot desk, which wasn't very pleasant, and also there weren't enough desks to hot desk successfully. People wound up working on the floor of the canteen. I mean, McLaren now don't even own their own building. That's pretty madly tragic, isn't it? That's just terrible. And here's a bit of serious gossip for you. I actually had, a few months ago, an email from a gentleman who shall remain unnamed, who said to me, "James, I work for McLaren, doing work for them as a subcontractor, and I have photographs, the plans, and the specification for the new P1. And they have upset me so much that I want to sell them to you, so you can show them to the public. And I'll basically be able to get one over on Woking." I said thank you, but no thank you to that one, because though I do have my own issues with McLaren, I think the people that work there don't deserve that sort of thing to happen. And this is why I was always upset at being branded the McLaren hater, because yeah, sure, I gave Woking and their dealers a hard time, but that's because they did things bloody wrong. And I want them to do well, I want them to be there, I want them to keep companies like Ferrari and a Lamborghini honest. But if they can't be bothered, well, why should anybody be bothered to spend money with them? I mean, if you had a child and you saw it kick another child and you said, "Don't do that, don't kick other children, it's wrong," you wouldn't be called a child hater, would you? You'd just be called a parent that was taking care of their child. And in my case, I feel the same way. We all have a bit of interest in McLaren. You must do, because you've clicked on this video. And I'd like to see them do well. And they continue to make utterly and completely baffling business decisions. So to give you maybe the most weird and crazy of all, they stopped production of the 570S in February, give or take, of 2019, with the 600 LT finishing later that year. The Artura then only really went on sale properly in, I think, 22 or maybe really 23, with the Artura Spider only coming out this year. So if you wanted a convertible mid-engine McLaren supercar thing and you didn't want a 720, there was 5 years between production. 5 years. Now, Ferrari, meanwhile, had the order books for both the F8 and the 296 open simultaneously, so you could see both the old and the new and decide which one it was that you preferred. McLaren took their volume seller, their most important model in many ways, and discontinued it without the replacement being even close to ready. In 2019, McLaren staff were telling me the car was breaking gearboxes left, right and centre. It didn't work. McLaren got given the gift of COVID, if you can call it that, because it gave them an extra year or two of development when nobody really noticed that they hadn't brought out a car. And even so, when the car launch happened, 2 of them caught fire. McLaren consistently have released products that are simply put not ready, and the issue is their products, when they work, have always been so blooming good, so amazing, that they could have easily have afforded to have made a 570.2, let's call it in Porsche parlance, which is simply the same thing, modestly faster, bit better put together, styling tweaks. It would have been a great car. They should have built on the platforms that they already had rather than rushing to create a new one, and they should have sought to fix the problems that they had: build quality and customer service. Because the simple fact is that to try and sustain and have a successful business, you need three things. You need a product that is super desirable. And in the case of the Artura, I'm not sure they have it. It looks almost the same as a 570 at a quick glance, and honestly, I don't know why you'd spend all this time and effort building an all-new car only to make it look exactly like the old one. And then you've got to make sure that your product is of a decent, serviceable quality. I mean, crikey, it is a legal requirement to sell a car here. I don't want to know how many McLarens got rejected, but it's a lot, because they simply put were not of satisfactory fit and finish for the price being paid. And a few of them were outright dangerous. And then finally, you've got to give your customers a reason to come back. Look after them, give them a new product that excites them. And from where I'm sat, I just don't see that happening. I mean, it's 2024 now, late into 2024. Here in Britain, I have not seen one Artura in the wild. I know Ferrari are also struggling with selling a V6 hybrid, and Maserati are struggling with selling a V6 supercar without a hybrid. But even so, I should have seen a few by now. I've seen a couple of 750s, but Arturas, not one. I have seen a few in the USA, and considering I've only spent about 4 weeks out of the last 3 years there, that's not right. I have a sneaking suspicion that McLaren doesn't really care about the British market anymore, because we like our cars to work, and the Americans just want their cars to be really, really fast down a drag strip, and McLaren seem to do quite well with that sort of thing. They've also become increasingly cagey about having people on press trips. And have you noticed how on some of the more recent launches, even the likes of the 720, even the people that really, really like McLarens, well, they sort of struggle to fall in love with them. I think then, to sort of compound the issue, McLaren have then become very, very risk averse. They daren't lend cars out to people for fear that they will break, or perhaps knowledge that they will. I have an almost annual ritual where I email McLaren and say, come on, let bygones be bygones. I had some issues with your products. That was a long, long time ago, but I have driven lots of your cars and I've generally loved all of them. Even the GT. I mean, if ever they're an example that McLaren have been smoking something, and if they've got any left, I would like some because it must be really good, the GT. I mean, what? Nobody asked for that car. Nobody wanted it. Nobody was sat there going, can we please have a 570S, but only slightly larger, with a sort of useless rear boot oven, looks that are a touch frumpy, and just a modestly softer suspension. That'll be perfect. We'd love that, please. Nobody asked for that car. Nobody. They could have built a 570.2. Instead, they built the GT. Do you know anyone that's bought a GT? I know a couple of people that bought one, because guess what? Nobody wanted one, so they depreciated like nobody's business. And I actually recommend people buy one for that exact reason. They're incredible value. And you know what? The new boss there, Michael Leiters, he does seem to be doing things the right way. He actually made the incredibly difficult, but I think ultimately right decision, to stop delivery of the Artura, because in spite of all the extra development they've done, it wasn't working. Apparently, Artura is now sat on version 3 of its platform. Yeah, the car I haven't even seen one of here. They have had 3 iterations of it. And you know what? I hate to do these videos without a sort of concrete conclusion or a bit of help at the end of it, because I don't want to be that sort of person that presents a problem and not a solution. But the fact is, even if McLaren did lend me a 750S for a month, let me drive around Europe, which they'll never do, ever, not once, not ever, because they know the car will break. They know it will let me down, and when it does, I'll tell you, and they're terrified of that. By the way, McLaren, if you're watching, this is an open invitation. Give me a car, prove me wrong. But I know you won't. Even if I loved it, even if I said it was the most amazingest thing I'd ever driven, well, I can have one of these for less than half the price. And I like the glass roof, which in these didn't work properly, so rather than fix it, they deleted. I like the fancy pants display here, which is, okay, kind of unnecessary, but also that's supercars, isn't it? They're unnecessary. They got rid of that too. I don't like the look of the front end or the rear of the 750. It's got a bit of a pig snout at the back, isn't it? McLaren just got obsessed with numbers. forgot to look after the people. And I think as part of that, it forgot to look after the quality of its own product. And then, rather than taking a step back and going, okay, this isn't good enough, we need to do it better, they just started to make excuses. They fumbled. I really want them to succeed. I really want them to survive. But I tell you something, right about now, at the back of Woking, there is a large hooded figure with a scythe. And I really hope he's lost and looking for directions. But I fear he might not be. Anyway, have I got things totally and completely wrong? Am I talking out of my backside? There's a very good chance that I am. Good party trick, that. But I'd like your opinions on the matter. And if you'd like to give it, don't forget to head down to the comment section, hit the like or dislike button, and subscribe too. I shall see you for the next one.